I'm over here at the Google Cloud Platform storage dashboard. And I'm over here in the browser section of the dashboard. Now, what I'd like to do in this demo is simply migrate files from one region to another. And that's one of the use cases for the transfer service, to transfer files from one Google data center in one region to another region. Another use case could be AWS or perhaps your own data center. In this case here, we're just going to go ahead and show you how to do it with Google. It's simple enough. Now, before I get started, a couple of things to point out. I have buckets. Under buckets, you can see that I have two migrate buckets. What I did is I just created two buckets so that you don't have to watch me create buckets again like I did in the previous demo. Now, I have a migrate to bucket and a migrate from bucket. What we're going to do is migrate files from Europe to USA. But before we do that, let's just make sure we got files in there in Europe. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 files in there. And this is the bucket EU. Let's go back and let's check what's in the USA bucket. Okay, so there's no files in the USA bucket. What we'd like to do now is I'd like to move the files here to the USA, basically. Now, the easiest way to do that, because there's only a few files, is to use the console. If we go over here to transfer, you can see that it brings up the transfer message that says create transfer. So it says you could transfer data to your cloud storage buckets from Amazon Simple Storage Service S3. You could also do HTTP or HTTPS servers or other buckets. You can schedule one time or you could schedule daily transfers. Again, you could go ahead and tag them. You could create prefixes, whatever you want to do. In this case here, for demo purposes, let's go ahead and create transfer. Now, you could see that it says select source. The source we want to use is a Google Cloud Storage bucket. Now, if you want to do AWS, when I click that, all you have to do is put in the URL of the bucket and put in your credentials. And it works fairly simply as well. You could also go to list of objects. So you put in the URL of, for example, your web server at your infrastructure, wherever that is, at your work or at a colo, whatever you're doing. Go ahead and do that as well. Now, there's, of course, specific formats you want to look at. Make sure you check that out because this will fail if you don't follow this to a T. Well, let's go to the Google Cloud bucket. Now you can see that it says browse. I want to just go click browse. Now you can see that it has the bucket names, bucket from and bucket to, right? Now it says select source. We're not at the destination yet. So the first thing we want to do is what? Select the source, right? So I'm going to go ahead and select the migrate bucket from the EU one. I selected that, and you can see the green check mark. Now, let's say, for example, you delete a bucket or you put improper permissions on it. That bucket will not come up green if it's not able, if the API is not able to essentially establish a connection. So it has to be able to find it and be able to establish some kind of connectivity, essentially. You could also go here, specify prefixes. One of the things that you could do is specify based on how old the file is. This is a good way to configure the transfer. And when we get to the end, we could also tell it to do it every day or whatever the schedule is. So it's fairly simple. This is a very simple utility. So let's go ahead and hide that. Actually, it's, again, we're not going to use that in this case, but easy enough to do if you want. So let's click continue. Now let's select the destination. Now, if I select USA, you can see that it's able to deal with that. Now, this is the important part. What about if you're transferring files from one bucket to another, and the from bucket has files, and let's say that they're similar files with the same name? What do you want to do with that? You have to tell it, do I want to overwrite the destination? Do I want to delete objects? Do I want to delete objects from the destination? So basically, you could also tell it to delete files from destination as it writes to the source, right? So you have some really good capabilities here as well. So take a look at this, but be careful with it, because you don't want to transfer files and then delete those files from the source if you may need to keep them down the road, or you need to archive them first. So pay attention to what you're doing. This is a great way to ruin a good weekend if you're not careful. So in this case, I'm going to just go click continue. By default, it'll drop the files in there, and it won't write over anything or cause issues. Since there's no files in there, I'm not worried about it. Now what I want to do is configure the transfer. I could do it now, or I could do it at a certain time. I could put in the time. I could put in the description. By default, it puts in the source and the target, and then once. That's just a one-time transfer. However, I could run it daily, and I could also change the name as well. But by default, most customers will likely just use this once. But this is a valid way for you to set up an archive process to do backups. For example, some customers like to drop files in a storage bucket and back them up. Again, that's up to you, or delete them at a certain time of the week or the month. Now what we want to do is just click create. Now you'll see that it's telling you what's going on. This is actually pretty cool. It tells you it's starting, and you'll see this progress. Now there's only a few files. The only challenge is that it's coming from Europe. Could be a pretty slow link. But this is, again, this is actually a Google data center to data center transfer, not from my house or another data center. This is basically Google to Google. So this should not be too long. There's only a few files. Now, I have noticed that there could be some latency in the browser. That is something that can happen. If you want to reduce any kind of latency in viewing or completion, then use gsutil. That'll work in this case. But again, if you have latency in your link from source to target, then that's a different story. You may want to use the transfer service. Again, check out the use case. So we'll come back to this when it's done. This could still take 5 or 10 minutes, depending on how busy things are. So the transfer completed. As you can see, it completed at 2:33. We started this probably about 4 minutes before. Sometimes you may want to also, hit the refresh just to make sure. Like I said, sometimes there's some latency and you just have to refresh. Let's go back to the browser and see what we have going on. Now, let's check the from bucket. We have the files there. Let's go back to the source bucket, and we have the files there as well. So that's how you do a very simple file transfer between Google Cloud regions. Remember, there is some data costs that will, of course, cost you, but be aware that you do get a specific threshold as well. You need to pay attention to that as well. With that said, that is an overview of how to transfer from one bucket to another in different regions. Simple enough. Now, one last thing I wanted to just walk you through. The transfer appliance. Remember, this is something that you need to order. There is a good cost to this. Google will validate your support contracts and your cloud account and everything. Usually you'll get this set up through a partner. That is that section. And if we go to settings, this is where you could select and validate your project access, the API access. You can see by default, it's got these permissions set. And I mean, you've got, again, this identity here, this identity here. You go over here to find out how you could modify the permissions on transfer if you so choose. Simple enough. And then interoperability as well. And that's about all that I had for the storage transfer service.